Hello, welcome to On Trail. Today is all about power, passion, and purpose. We're joined by Jen Gadwa, who's a trailblazer in adaptive mountain biking. She's not only redefining what it means to ride, she's also reshaping the sport for greater inclusion and accessibility. This chat is packed with insight, stories, and straight up stoke. So buckle up, because this ride is anything but ordinary. Hi, Jen. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
To start us off, what is adaptive mountain biking?
Adaptive mountain biking is basically any modification that you make to biking to make it more accessible for people. Traditionally, people might think of it as having a three-wheel bike, a bike that's, an e-bike or something like that. But there's lots of different disabilities that might require some adaptation on bikes. So for example, someone with a limb difference might use a certain attachment for a prosthetic. We have some folks with spinal cord injury who ride e-bikes that don't have pedals, that are full e-bikes. Some folks, again, who ride bikes who might need help with hand strength. So they might use like a special glove to wrap around their hand. So it's basically just any modification to what we would consider a traditional bike that will help other people access the outdoors who might not otherwise be able to do that.
Tell me about how adaptive mountain biking is written about and talked about in the wider world.
So, we were talking a little bit earlier about, the narrative of, when people have an injury or have something that, essentially causes them to require access to adaptive sports, and the way that people talk about disability as though it's negative or, are very apologetic or, people who ride adaptive bikes, they just want to get out there and crush it, just like people on upright bikes, right? So in a sense, yes, we know people are stoked on the bikes and they're interested, but we also don't need to be congratulated for existence, right? So sometimes we get on the trail, there's like this really weird patronizing thing that happens where people will be passing by and they'll say, "Good for you." And we're like, yeah, good for you too. Like it's weird. And this sort of narrative about, it being sad, like disability is sad and it's negative. And there's lots of hard shit about it, right? Don't get me wrong. But you shouldn't assume that somebody has a sad life or that, they have lesser value within society because they have a disability, whether that be visible physically or whether that be, really anything, a speech impairment, an issue with cognition, people who are neurodivergent, all of the above. Everybody has a different flavor, right? We're all different human beings. And so at the end of the day, if we can allow people to ride and, make space for riders who we don't traditionally see on the trails, don't assume someone's ability because of what your own biases are. That's the other thing that we run into a lot. So, if I'm meeting people for the first time or going out on a trail, they'll instantly be like, "Oh, I bet you can't ride this." And I'm like, watch, hold my beer, right?
Right.
And it's just that like sort of making those assumptions about people. Like we don't need that. Even within our own community, there's diversity. We're not all the same. We're not a monolith. In the adaptive community, sometimes, we'll read an article that's written and it's from the perspective of someone who doesn't have a disability talking about, creating adaptive sports. And it's like, well, why aren't you talking with people who are in it? Why aren't you talking to those people versus taking someone else's opinion on it or having someone else speak for you? So I think that's really important. And just to recognize too that, when we are talking about this, a lot of the knowledge that I have, it's not my own knowledge. It's things that I've learned from other people, right? It's this collective sharing of wisdom among the adaptive community where, people are more than willing to give that information and to help you out. And I think that really deserves some credit, not just saying like, "Oh, this is my event." Yeah, sure. Like I'm facilitating this, but, I've been to a similar event where I've had a coach do all of the work and teach me how to do this so that then I can do it. So yeah, it's a really interesting group of folks. And I think, there's so much to learn from everybody out there. And I find that's the best part of being on the trail is I meet someone new every time, somebody who I may have never met if it wasn't for biking.
Tell us about your sweet setup.
The bike that I ride is by a company called Bowhead, and they're based out of Calgary. I actually have two of their models of bikes. So the one bike that I have is called the Bowhead Reach, And it's a 3-wheel bike, 2 in the front, 1 in the back. They call that one a tadpole style. And it's a full e-bike. Each wheel has independent suspension on it. So one of the main features of this bike that sort of sets it apart within the industry is there's an articulating feature on the front of the bike where basically you can open a pin and it unlocks the wheels so that they can move independently over obstacles. So it makes it super capable. It's also one of the narrowest adaptive bikes out there. So it's the width of a traditional set of handlebars on a regular mountain bike. And then the other model of bike that I have from Bowhead is called the RX. And that one is a hand crank bike with an e-assist. It has a Bosch motor on it. And so you can put, your different levels of e-assist on it, but it does require your input to get the output. So that's a little bit more like, what I might consider like my gravel bike or, kind of park bike, whereas the Reach is like the downhill mountain bike.
What do you love about them?
Everything. So, the bike has literally allowed me to get back outside in the mountains. You can huck this thing down all kinds of trails, and there's a lot of places that you cannot get just by arm power. Right. So being able to have a motor system on that's as capable as it is, you could just be outside for hours, really in the back of the woods, and just the accessibility that it brings is amazing.
Speaking of trails, where do you ride?
I'm in Kitchener, so I do ride at the Hydro Cut quite a bit.
Nice.
Over the past year, I've started to ride a lot at the Pines in Woodstock.
Super fun.
Yeah, they've got a couple of really awesome guys on the board who've become my weekly support riders. So we have a standing weekend date where we can get together and go ride there. I've rode up at Albion for the 24-hour a couple of times. And I really like to ride out west. So I learned to ride in Alberta. And then every year I try and take a trip or a few to BC.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Squamish is my favorite. Yeah.
Is that right? Is it all slabs and all tech? I've never ridden there myself.
There's a lot of really good flow there too. So it's a pretty good mixture. I'd say a lot of their downhill flow trails work really well for our adapted bikes because most of them are machine built. Some of the narrow or hand cut stuff doesn't work as well for us, or real sort of off camber side slope with exposure. That kind of stuff's a bit harder to ride. But they do have a fair bit that we've tested in Squamish that they're not marked as adaptive trails, but they're, trails that the bike is capable on. It's more user dependent.
What makes an awesome ride for you?
Just being with people, riding with a crew of women and folks that I've had a chance to ride with over the years since I first started. It's so cool to go back a year later and see everybody's progression over time of, how confident they are on the bike and how much more control people have, their body position. And I just actually got back from Squamish this week. So we had 7 riders out there. And we participated in an enduro race in Squamish, and it was fantastic.
What makes a trail adaptive friendly?
A lot of times people will think that you have to ride an adaptive trail because you're on an adaptive bike. So it's become kind of a buzzword for people where, especially with grants and funding and things like that, it's something where, we want to encourage more people being able to get on the trails and making things, accessible, but it doesn't have to be a paved, flat, boring trail for it to be adaptive. So really anything that a quote unquote normal mountain bike can ride, most adaptive bikes can get on those trails. So, I would say the limitation is if there's a real pinch point, a real narrow point. So sometimes if trees are too close together, but traditionally, if a regular bike can get through those trees, I should be able to get through it. I might have to, put the bike a little sideways or have somebody sort of roll me through it or around it. But, most trails we can make work. It's just a matter of taking the right people out with you.
What's the length of a sort of an average adaptive bike?
The main difference in sort of the length of the bike is more relevant for, say, jumps, right?
Right.
So if you get 2 jumps that are too close together, sometimes you'll get the back end bucking up and you don't have enough space to land in between.
Right. Okay.
But, most of the time, otherwise, you can sort of work around things. And even drops, most drops are rollable unless they're 4 feet or more. right? So even if you have, a drop that's a little bigger than what you want to do, you can basically have somebody spot you where they can come up in front of the bike. You can roll into it really controlled, and then someone can kind of bump you down through that.
Okay.
So yeah, there's lots of workarounds for sure.
Okay. How welcoming has the mountain bike community been to adaptive mountain biking?
I really haven't run into any problems with it. I'm kind of always out hesitant, waiting for somebody to chew me out about my motor, because it is a little bit loud. That's the one thing I will say is, when I'm on the trails, I'm really aware of it because it's louder than everyone else's bike. So if I'm riding with a new group, I'm always, aware enough to tell them, especially the people who are riding in front of me, don't go faster because you hear the motor.
Right.
Because you'll want to, but just because I have a motor doesn't mean that I go full out. Sometimes I have to go slower than what a regular bike does just for, different variables that come up on the trail or different obstacles. But by and large, I'd say, I haven't had any issues with it. People are generally pretty good about it.
I suppose it's like having one of those really loud hubs that is like having a bag of bees in the back end, right? Like, oh, I have to go faster. This person's catching on me, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can tell too, because you can hear people like just in front of you huffing, and I'm like, no, don't do it. Just go your speed.
Right. How accessible are most of the trails that you ride? And are there any major changes or improvements that you think need to be made, or are the changes kind of simple, or do they need to be doing it all?
Yeah, most of the trails that I ride on, it's really simple things that can improve the flow of a trail for me. So, for example, the folks that I ride with at the Pines, the first few times they came with me, they just brought a spray can, paint, and it would just be like the occasional little stump, or something where it wouldn't cause any problem for you because you have, that narrower line that you're going through. Whereas if there's a stump, especially if it's under brush and I can't see it, that's going to be something that can kind of tilt you off the trail. Right. It's not really a big deal if it's, if it's fairly low, or even if it's broad enough for you to run your tire right over it. So you don't necessarily have to take out all of those barriers, but sometimes just simple things like that, or even branches, if you've got some really low lying branches, like I always wear a full face because I eat the trees when I'm going through. But, I really haven't been on any trails that I've had to, request modifications to. The other thing that I find a little bit tricky sometimes is, how sometimes they'll put a feature at the beginning to act as a filter.
Right.
And sometimes those will kind of trip me up. Like, for example, if there's, sloped entry into something and they put a rock in the middle of it and it's off camber, that's something where, if it was just a couple inches out of the way, I wouldn't be at as much of a risk of tipping. But that's also, that plays into like my own ability as a rider as well, right? Yeah. So if I know how to manage myself and my equipment, I can get through that. If I'm not confident enough yet in my skill, that's just not yet a trail for me. So it's not even necessarily really about, the structure of the trail or the physical barriers that are on there. It's a big thing about adaptive riding is having people. Because you don't really go on the trails by yourself. You can if it's somewhere that you're familiar with, but it's not really that smart if you get stuck out somewhere. You can't exactly just unclip out of your bike and push it out of there. So
what advice would you give to somebody who's just getting into adaptive mountain biking?
Go for it. I mean, I think the barrier to entry here in Ontario is still pretty high, right? We don't have formal programming yet. You can't just rent one of these bikes. So that's a big barrier for people. The finances involved in it, like if you want to get one of these decked out and new, they're $25,000, right? So like you can't just go and get one of these at, a bike shop. You have to order them. They come custom. They take months to get. Most people will try and apply for some grant funding to offset the cost. So initially when I learned, I went to an adaptive program out in Canmore, Alberta called Rocky Mountain Adaptive. And it was amazing. But, just thinking about the barriers to get there, there's a lot of people who don't have the ability to travel, right? Or who don't have the financial ability to do that. So when we think about adaptive riding, you're looking at, a very small percentage of people who have access to it. And that's not accessible. That's not equity, right? Like when we think about people being able to participate in a sport, we need those things to be accessible to people. regardless of whether or not they have money for it or, the ability to store a bike or the ability to get transportation, all of the above. So over the past 2 years that I've been riding, it's been one of my goals to get some programming going in Ontario for people who can't travel or, just for people to be able to try these bikes out. Because one of the other things that will sometimes happen is sometimes somebody will buy a bike and then discover that's not the right one for them, because you can't try all these things before you buy them. And I mean, that's a huge investment in terms of equipment, of you having something that you now can't use or that's not suited for your body, right? So I've taken a coaching course. I've been riding as much as I can. And then last year I applied for a grant to run an adaptive mountain biking camp here in Ontario.
Tell us all about it.
Yeah. So I have a friend who's coming from BC. She's part of Squamish Adaptive Mountain Biking Association. And there's actually a group of us from Ontario that are part of their board of directors because we all learned to ride out there and we're associated with that group. So I'm actually having her come out to co-instruct the course with me. And the way that it's going to run is the first part of the camp is for women and non-binary riders to attend and to do like a structured lesson throughout the day. So basically do a bike fitting, talk to people about safety, how to work each of their bikes, and then do some skills and progression throughout the day. Actually, prior to people starting to ride on Saturday, we were planning to have a volunteer training on the Friday so that we could do a session about intro to adaptive biking, volunteering, etiquette around working with people with disabilities, and then talk a little bit about the bikes because we'll actually have 4 different models with us.
Nice.
So this has turned into a bit of an endeavor. Jen Bennett from Turkey Point Mountain Bike Club has invited a lot of people. And I am not a fan of public speaking, but my friend who's coming out here, Sierra, she will chat your face off about adaptive biking. So I'm going to lean on her to do some of the presenting to people. So we should have a pretty good turnout for that, just kind of a meet and greet and also like an informal session so that people can ask questions and just get a chance to see what these bikes look like. On the Sunday, we're hosting a drop-in demo day for people. And we just had so much interest and not enough bikes for people to attend for the whole weekend. So this will allow people to come that day and still try out a bike, even though we can't do that for the whole weekend. Hopefully, as we get more equipment, we'll be able to open it up to more people.
How can we be better allies?
Yeah, good question. I think right now, because things are sort of in the beginning stages, it's just about places being welcoming, which I've had nothing but good experience with reaching out to Turkey Point Club and Long Point Eco and other riders and just saying, hey, I'm thinking about running this thing. And everybody's been super helpful with that. So that's just, kind of getting the ball rolling. In terms of getting more people on bikes physically and what has to happen for that to sort of move forward, I think that's within, our group of people to make bikes available to people. So part of my role is that I've been working with the Hand Cycling Club of Canada, and they've got an amazing group of folks who have been riding a lot longer than I have, both on road bikes and off-road mountain bikes. And so my goal in working with them is to get some grant funding. And what ideally we would like is to have a 20-foot trailer with multiple types of bikes that we could take around to events and let people try at no charge.
Wow.
And just get people out, get them on bikes. Because right now, the way that it runs is you pretty much have to own a bike to be able to go somewhere.
Sure, makes
right.
sense.
So it's really about finance is a big thing. So getting funding and, just for people, I think, to be aware that this exists, right? Like there's some people who've never seen an adaptive bike or they've only seen it on YouTube. So I get a lot of like, and in the beginning, it used to kind of freak me out a bit because I don't really love being the center of attention. So I was always very aware of, people staring at me. And it's like, oh, okay, they're not staring at me. They're staring at the bike, right? And they'd come and they'd be like, all the teenage boys, they're like, yo, bro, are those Magura 7s? And I'm like, yeah, are they good? Like, I don't know what all these things are. You know, they're like,
Yeah.
look at the suspension on that. And I'm like, I
Right.
don't even know what you're talking about. But
Yeah.
they, didn't skimp on any of the specs on these bikes. So
These sorts of events, like the Adaptive Riding Weekend, don't happen by themselves. Who do we need to give a shout out to make sure that they get credit for helping out?
Yeah, good question. So the grant funding that I got was through a group in Toronto called 880 Cities. And they are sponsored by a really big group called the Balsam Foundation. So it was a micro grant program of $5,000 that I was able to get funding. And then basically a whole host of volunteers. So I've got a photographer who's volunteering to come out. Multiple riders are coming. I've got my two awesome support people from the Pines are actually missing the Pines open house for me. So they've agreed to get a trailer and haul some bikes, because that's the other big barrier is when you run an event like this, oftentimes you're hauling bikes and people in wheelchairs. And, when we go to trails, you're sometimes doing that multiple times a day in and out of vehicles. That's why we picked Turkey Point, because we could stay at the Eco Center and people can just ride from there. There's no shuttling involved. So, Long Point Eco has been super supportive in that way too, making sure that we have access to their cabin. They've got a fully adapted washroom. They have a ramp that they can use on some of their wilderness suites. So, all of those people along the way really, deserve a huge shout out. And you can't make an event run like this on your own. It's all people and connections and putting the word out there, and then just saying yes to everybody who wants to help.
Where can people find out more?
So we don't have a website because it's just me, but I do have an Instagram, and it's at ON_AMTB_riders. So Ontario Adaptive Riders. And then in the link of my Instagram bio, so my own Instagram is at bionic_heart_roller. There's a link there, and it's got a whole bunch of links under that, where it's got information about adaptive biking in Ontario. It's got information about that program out west that I was telling you about. Just a whole host of, there's a link to a presentation in there for volunteers. And I'm actually going to use that at the event, just have a QR code posted so that people can just click that and they'll have that information to be able to look at.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and I wish you all the luck with the weekend.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.